So are vintage guitars really superior to their modern equivalents? So I wanted to explore that question by comparing this 1952 Martin D-18 with this 2015 reissue. So in today's video, I'll do several sound comparisons between the two guitars. I'll talk about the specs as well as my recording chain. I'll also share my observations around the pros and cons of considering a vintage versus modern guitar. And ultimately, I'm trying to answer the question whether it's worth going down the vintage rabbit hole when looking for your perfect acoustic guitar. So as for my recording chain, I'm gonna start with one of the most important and overlooked parts of the signal chain when it comes to recording acoustic guitars, and that is the room and recording environment itself. I'm in a small bedroom. It's probably 12 feet by 12 feet with carpeted floor. And I have GIK acoustic panels to help with sound treatment, to absorb reflections and low end to provide the most accurate recording environment I can. From there, I'm using a Peluso P12 large diaphragm tube condenser microphone, and it's inspired by the classic AKG C12. I have the mic aimed around the 12th to 14th fret, probably a foot back. From there, the mic's going into an Aurora Audio GT8, which is a Neve style recording preamp. From there, the signal goes into my Apogee Symphony recording interface, then into Cubase. As for guitar strings, I typically like to use whatever came on the guitar when I received it. And the reason I prefer that is it's usually an integral part of the sound that appealed to me when I purchased the guitar. The one exception I make to that is if the guitar came with coated strings. As much as I've tried to like them, they just feel a little slippery and awkward when I play them, so I will replace those. And in the case of the vintage D-18, it did come with coated strings. It had D'Addario XS light gauge. They sounded great, but I just didn't get on with the feel of them, so I replaced them with the standard D'Addario phosphor bronze light gauge. And I'm really happy to report the sound of the guitar was just as good, if not better, than when I originally received it. And I've got both guitars set up with a brand new, fresh set of these. So let's move on to the sound samples. So up first, I'm going to play the intro motif on each of the guitars, so let's check that out. So the vintage D-18 really spoke to me on this part. I felt it was very open, clear, with great string separation, and many of the nuances of the part really shine through. Whereas the modern D-18 had more pronounced bass response, which I felt masked some of the intricacy of this part. I think that bass response could be an advantage in different contexts, so we'll check that out a little bit later. So the specs on the vintage D-18, this is a 1952. There were 777 of these made in that year, which is a pretty cool number. This has a spruce top, mahogany back, sides, and neck. It has a Brazilian rosewood fingerboard as well as a Brazilian rosewood bridge. I couldn't find the exact nut width on this and hadn't had a chance to measure it, but to me it feels closer to a 1 11/16 nut width. If anyone happens to know where I can find that information, please hit me up in the comments. The neck profile is very comfortable, has a slight V shape to it, and the guitar has been lovingly played over the decades. The lacquer is quite worn out, has a satin feel, and is just lovely to play. So in this next sound sample, I'm going to get into some strumming parts so we can hear what kind of differences there are in that context. I thought both guitars sounded great in that context, and either could work depending on what flavor you're going for. I thought the extra bass response was more of an asset than a liability in this context, as it helped unify the strings and create more of a warm, cohesive sound. So as for the specs on the 2015 D-18, also has a spruce top, mahogany back, sides, and neck. So where this one differs from the 1952 spec is instead of Brazilian rosewood, it has an ebony fingerboard and an ebony bridge. Additionally, the nut width is wider. This one has a 1 3/4 inch nut width. The neck profile is quite different as well. This one is flatter and more oval shaped rather than V-shaped. So another important spec to call out about the reissue D-18 is the bracing. It has scalloped X bracing, and it's been forward shifted for extra bass response. So that extra bass response we're hearing in these samples is very much by design. So all of these samples so far have been in DADGAD tuning from low to high. That's D-A-D-G-A-D. I picked up that tuning from Jimmy Page back as a teenager and find it incredibly inspiring, and my creativity really peaks when playing in that tuning. So I'll stay in that tuning for a few more sound samples, and then we'll shift over to standard tuning. When people talk about vintage sounding guitars, they often use terms like woody, clear, open, string separation. And I think that last sound sample really showcases that aspect of the vintage Martin. When I auditioned it in the shop, to me, the guitar sounded almost as if it was already mixed and mastered. There's no imbalances in the frequency spectrum. There's no odd resonance peaks anywhere. Just a really balanced sounding guitar that sounds finished when you're playing it in the room and under a microphone. That's one of the things that really appealed to me about that guitar. So one of the drawbacks when shopping for a vintage guitar is you really have to educate yourself about some of the issues these guitars can have, which are natural to develop over decades. You could have anything from the top lifting up to the bridge becoming unglued. They can develop cracks in the top, back, or sides. The neck angle can also drift, requiring a reset. Frets could be shot, etc., etc. And I've had some very mixed experiences buying vintage acoustics in the past. And so what really appealed to me about this example is it's had all of the work done that makes it a great player-grade instrument, as well as maybe more comfortable knowing the guitar is going to be quite stable for years to come. This one's had a neck reset, new saddle, new nut, and new frets. So let's focus on that string separation quality even more. This next part to me is more like a piano part. It really showcases what I love about the vintage Martin. So I think the reissue sounds perfectly fine there. Again, has a little bit more bass response. The strings blend together a little bit. But for me, there's something really special about the vintage version where you really hear my fingers on the strings, the wood of the guitar, and a lot of the nice nuances of that part. So one of the other things that really appealed to me about the vintage Martin is the honest wear. When you're playing the guitar, it just has such a broken in and organic feel, and it feels very lively. The finish is paper thin, having been worn down over the years, and it's just such a lovely playing experience. I also love how the spruce has ambered over time. And the figure in the spruce top is also very pronounced vertically with very tight rings. So as far as the aesthetic vibe and the feel of the instrument, there's just something that's so difficult to replicate in a modern guitar. And I'm sure the reissue, after decades of aging and play wear, would start to resemble this one. But otherwise, I think that's very difficult to find in a modern build. So up next, I'm going to switch to standard tuning, and I'll try to work my way up the neck a bit to hear how the guitars resonate in the upper registers. So I thought both guitars sounded nice there. They both maintain their intonation up the neck. It sounded quite balanced. Perhaps the reissue with its extra bass response had a little bit more fullness in the upper registers, but I didn't find the difference that meaningful. So up till now, I've been using a Herco Flex 75 Holy Grail pick. These are my favorite guitar picks, both for electric and acoustic guitar. I feel like they add a lovely chirp to the attack. However, they're a little tricky to get used to. The nylon is very slippery, so you do have to adjust your technique, as I find the plectrum sort of slips off the strings. However, I've gotten used to it by now, and I feel like the tonal trade-off is worth it for me. So for now, I'm gonna put the pick down, and let's check out what these guitars sound like with some finger picking. So the vintage guitar, again, had that lovely intimacy and clarity, which I think is one of its strengths. I also found that the warmth of the reissue really worked well here, and I could see that being a better choice in the example of accompanying yourself without any other instrumentation. So let's grab the guitar pick again and do some basic strumming and compare the guitars in that context. So the extra bass response of the reissue, again, I think provided a nice, big, warm, cohesive sound there. So up next, I'm gonna try to showcase the headroom of these guitars by playing really soft and then gradually getting louder. I don't know how this is gonna hold up with the YouTube compression, but let's give it a try and see what differences we can hear. In the room, the modern variant was a bit louder and again had a little bit more low end, whereas the vintage example was slightly less so on both dimensions. I don't know how much of that has to do with just differences between these two examples versus the modern construction versus vintage construction type, but let me know what you were hearing. So lastly, let's check out these guitars in the context of a continuous piece of music. I think when being these guitars back to back in this setting, it really exaggerates some of the tonal differences. So listen closely and let me know what you're hearing. Really curious which guitar you preferred in that setting. I found that I leaned more toward the vintage guitar when it came to the individual picked parts, where that string separation and clarity really came out. And then when I was doing the full-on strumming, I tended to favor the modern guitar for its warmth and cohesion. So ultimately, do I think it's worth going down the vintage guitar rabbit hole when looking for your perfect acoustic guitar? So I've had some very mixed experiences with this. I've taken home some vintage guitars only to realize later they needed a ton of setup work to really be performing optimally, and it was quite frustrating. I've had better luck once I became more educated and learned what to look for. I've been really enjoying my vintage D-18, and I've also had a great experience with my vintage 1964 Gibson Southern Jumbo. That said, there are some pros and cons to be aware of when choosing between a vintage and modern guitar. Some of the pros of the vintage guitar, I do think they just have a feel and a voice that's difficult to find in a modern build. I think a lot of the adjectives do hold up around the vintage guitar sounding more dry, more woody, having a lot of great clarity and string separation, as well as balance across the frequency spectrum. I don't know how much of that's just due to aging, the wood's drying out over time, different construction methods and/or materials from back in the day. However, there is just something to the sound of a vintage instrument. I also think the feel of a vintage instrument is quite unique. The way that the guitar ages, the way the lacquer thins out, the way the guitar vibrates against your body and in your hand is also quite unique and feels quite inspiring to play. And then again, just personally, I love the honest wear. This guitar, if it could talk, I'm sure it could tell you all kinds of stories. So I just love the old soul of this instrument and find that quite captivating and inspiring. So some of the cons of a vintage instrument, they can have lots of problems, like I've talked about earlier. These things just age and their structural integrity fades over time. You have to be quite careful with humidity and temperature changes to not inflict any unnecessary damage on these instruments. They may require neck resets, saddle adjustments, crack repairs, new frets, etc., etc. So really educate yourself and be discerning when shopping for a vintage instrument. An additional con is the vintage example is quite a bit more expensive than the modern example. I think this 2015 version back in 2015 was retailing around $2,500 US, whereas the vintage example is almost 3 times that amount. And so some of the pros and cons of the modern reissue, I would give it the upper hand when it comes to setup and playability. I think modern guitars are just simply built with a higher level of precision than their vintage counterparts. And so while both guitars played great and all the right work has been done on my vintage example and it plays very nice, the modern guitar did have just slightly better playability. Another advantage is that the modern guitar is not going to need any kind of maintenance or work, so you won't have to worry about neck resets or crack repairs for many decades to come, so long as you're taking good care of the instrument. And so the last advantage I can think of for the modern guitar is price value. You're getting a great sounding instrument with great playability without any of the added expense of repair and maintenance. The biggest con I can think of for the reissue is if you really have your heart set on that vintage voice or vintage aesthetic, you're gonna have to wait decades to really break that guitar in and wear it down over time. So I think unfortunately the only way to really get there is to go vintage. So that wraps it up. I would love to hear which guitar you preferred and why, and what's been your experience between vintage and modern guitars, and do you have a preference? Let me know. So let me know if you'd be interested in more acoustic guitar comparison videos. I have access to a Martin D-28 reissue, which we could compare to the reissue D-18. I could also do a comparison of the 1964 Gibson Southern Jumbo versus the Martin D-18 to hear how two different vintage mahogany-bodied guitars compare. So let me know if any of those topics pique your interest, and I'd be happy to dive into them. Thanks a ton for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please consider liking, commenting, and/or subscribing. That would really help me get the content to others that may find it useful as well. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.